Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Kim Needham. I'm the Director of Planning and Development Services. We are recording this meeting so that some members who aren't able to attend are able to watch the meeting later. We'll post it on the website. So I'll call the meeting to order. And if I can just get an approval of the agenda for today, that would be great from a member of our AAC. Director Mack, and a seconder.
A second.
Okay. Claire, have you got that? So thanks everybody for coming out today. We'll try and keep this as brief as we can. I thought we could start today with just a round of introductions so everybody knows who's here, because we have a mix of people who are on the AAC as well as a representative from the Ministry of Agriculture. So we'll start with Claire, and Claire, if you can pass it off to Jay, and if everybody can pass off an introduction to someone else, that would be great.
Sure, thank you. My name is Claire Dewar. I'm a senior planner here at the SRD. My role in this meeting is really just to support facilitation, a bit of moderation, and I hope to answer any questions. I do work mainly with the area BAAC, so familiar with AACs, but not the staff liaison with this particular one. So just filling in today, and I'll pass it over to Jay.
Anyone who hasn't met me, my name is Jay McEwen. I'm the building official for the Squamish-Lillooet Regional District. I am happy to be here today to answer any questions as far as requirements from the SRD's building department or the BC Building Code to temporary farm worker housing that people may have. Yeah, and I can pass it on to whoever's next. Sorry.
How about Director Mack?
Oh, great. Director Mack, please.
Hi, my name is Russell Mack. I'm the Area C Director, and happy to be here. Thank you.
All right, Conley?
Hi, I'm Conley. I'm a regional agrologist with the Ministry of Agriculture for your area. Most of you know me. I'm just here to provide any ministry input, but probably today mostly just as an observer. Thanks.
And Jeff?
Thanks, Kim. I'm Jeff Waitman. I work a little bit with Conley. I'm the team lead for land use planning. I'm in Victoria, but grew up around Squamish and Pemberton throughout most of my life, so I know a little bit about the area, but similar to Conley, just listening in and happy to contribute where I can, hoping to show up to more of these or split them with Conley to relieve him a little bit of as his workload shifts around a little bit.
Great, thanks, Jeff. How about Kevin?
I'm Kevin Clark. I am here in my civilian role, but I'm also the manager of the Pemberton Valley Diking District.
Thanks. We'll move on to Tara.
Hi, my name's Tara Ritchie. I've been on the AAC for a year now. I've also sit on many boards with Lillooet Nation, including our land management board, and help create many policies within my nation. I'm very happy to be here.
Thanks, Tara. We'll move on to Alyssa.
There, I'm Alyssa Belter. I'm a farmer in Area C. I run a certified organic vegetable farm with my partner, David.
And Alyssa, you're also a member of the AAC.
No, I'm not.
Not anymore? Oh, okay. We'll move on to Anna.
Hi, I'm Anna Helmer. I'm with the Pemberton Farmers Institute, and I'm a farmer up here in Pemberton.
Thanks, Anna. We'll go to Elliot.
Hi there, I'm Elliot. I've been in Pemberton for the last 15, 16 years, came out to become a farmer and farm. Now I'm running a cannabis company in Pemberton. But yeah, hear about the agricultural land, and yep, right on.
And Elliot, you're on the AAC, correct?
Yes, yeah.
Okay. And lastly, who have we got here? Michelle Bex. You're muted. There we go.
Unmute. Yeah, we go. Hi, I'm Michelle Bex. I'm a seed potato and carrot farmer in Pemberton and a member of the Pemberton Farmers Institute.
Great. So I think, is there anybody I've missed? I think we've got everybody.
I think you missed Randy.
Oh, okay. Randy.
Hi,
Good to see
Randy
you.
Links here. Been in the Pemberton Valley about 25 years. Have a little hobby farm. I've been on the Agriculture Advisory Committee approximately 10 years and just finishing my stint there.
Thanks, Randy. Okay, great. Well, nice of everybody to show up. Thanks for joining us. We'll move on to review and we did the approval of the agenda, I guess. We need to review the minutes of the previous meeting. Did anybody have any issues or concern with the previous meeting minutes? This would apply to AAC members only. No comments. Okay, so motion to receive the last minutes. Randy, any seconder? Director Mac, seconded. Thank you. So we'll move on to today's content. So we have brought this before the AAC previously. They supported the bylaw and had some comments. So I wanted to give you a staff update on this. And after we give the staff update, we'll move into a discussion. So to start, I'm just gonna refer to the report that was presented to the AAC. I think you all have access to it. So since the last AAC meeting, a few things have happened. So I'd just like to go through those with you. So we did hold a public information meeting on January 25th. It was held on Zoom and also in person at the SLRD office. And we held that meeting in order to collect further input on the proposed bylaw 1742. So at the meeting, we had information from the public or the Pemberton Farmers Institute and other members of the public. In particular to this group, I won't get into some of the other issues because they were more related to Wedgwoods, but specific to this particular group, we did have some comments around the classification of tiny homes on wheels and temporary farm worker housing. So that was raised as an issue. And we can get into that. I'm going to go through that in a little bit. We also received additional referral comments from the Ministry of Agriculture and Food, the Agricultural Land Commission, Vancouver Coastal Health, as well as our SLRD building official. So these comments have helped to kind of formulate our sort of proposed approach to this. The SLRD also did additional research on temporary farm worker housing to see how other communities are regulating this. So we wanted to provide additional clarification around temporary farm worker housing and camping definition. And the meeting today is really to have the AAC and the PFI have an opportunity to provide additional final comments on this bylaw before we proceed for second reading. So we're hoping to take this to the February 22nd SLRD board meeting. So that is next week. So we would take these any comments to that. At the recent AAC meeting, which was in November, they made a motion that they recommend support of all but the temporary farm worker housing provisions and definition of recreational vehicle in the bylaw, requesting that more information be provided to the AAC on whether a recreational vehicle can be used as a form of temporary farm worker housing under these new regulations. So some of the things we heard from the AAC were that there was, rising land and housing costs. It's causing pressure on farmers, and it's very important, of course, for farmers to keep producing. We heard that recreational vehicles are already being used to house temporary farm workers. And just so you know, that's actually not allowed. So if you do see recreational vehicles, don't assume that they've been approved because there haven't been approvals for temporary farm worker housing, but they are seen around the valley. I know we do see them, and technically they are a bylaw enforcement issue if we see them, because people are not allowed to just put RVs on and reside in them. We have somebody else joining us, it looks like. I know you're not Anna Helmer, so, so the new person who joined, would you mind introducing yourself? You're muted.
Sorry, I'm Simone from Root Down Farm.
Okay, hi Simone. Welcome to our meeting. We're just starting into talking about the bylaw.
I'll also just note, Kim, for a quick second, that we do have 2 attendees that have joined us.
Okay.
And if we can get into the discussion part, we can sort of field questions.
Who are the attendees?
Olivia,
yeah,
and Ariella.
Okay, Olivia Kester?
I'm not sure.
That must be. Olivia, would you mind introducing yourself?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, I'm Olivia Kester. I have Blackwater Creek Orchard up in Devine. I'm also an AAC member. I didn't receive an invite though, so I'm on the public side.
Oh, okay. Maybe Claire can help you get into the main webinar.
Thank you.
Sorry about that.
No worries.
And is there someone else here who hasn't introduced themselves? I'm not seeing the whole screen here.
Ariella.
Okay, we'll move along. Ariella is here, but I'm not hearing from her. So another comment that we heard from the AAC as to rationale that, for why they want to see temporary farm worker housing is, farmers depend on accommodation for seasonal employees. And they also noted that they want to ensure all farm workers live in an up-to-date, they said requiring farm workers to live in up-to-date accommodation is unreasonable, and it will create more regulations and substantial costs for already overburdened farmers. So that's what we heard. So I just wanted to go through some of the things that we've heard since we presented this last to the AAC. So one of the things we heard was, when would we determine if a property proposing a secondary farm residence has farm status? We're not proposing to change anything. Typically, this would be at the building permit stage. It's not necessarily ideal because things can always change, but it's our sort of best, period of time in order to determine farm status. So based on our research, we've noted that it's a pretty common requirement for temporary farm worker applications by both the ALC and other local governments to have farm status. Staff feel that maintaining this requirement for a secondary farm residence will help to ensure that secondary farm residences are actually accessory to a farm operation. And the concern would be that, people, with the price of land and everything else, we're seeing a lot of speculation with farmland. So we really don't want to see people buying up farmland just so that they can have a second residence. It really should be associated with farming, and farm status is our best way of dealing with that. And, nothing's perfect in this world, and it's farm status may not be the perfect tool, but it's really kind of one of the only ones we have in our toolbox. So in terms of temporary farm worker housing, what we heard was that there was a feeling that the SLRD is really putting stringent requirements on farmers that are already facing harm, rising costs and a lack of housing, etc. So some of the concerns were around the requirement to meet the flood construction level. There was one person noted that they didn't, want to bring fill onto ALR land. There was also concern about the requirement for temporary farm worker housing to have to meet the BC Building Code. Many expressed interests in using recreational vehicles, tiny homes, and other wheeled vehicles as temporary farm worker housing. And so what we've decided to do in response to that is we're amending our language around the requirement for the geotechnical report, really to just specify that that is at the discretion of the building official. He does have full discretion in that regard. So if he believes there is an FCL concern, he can require that. We're also proposing to update something in the bylaw to reference the Drinking Water Protection Act. And I note that Vancouver Coastal Health has expressed additional concerns with health, particularly servicing for temporary farm worker housing. And they recommended that the Drinking Water Protection Act be added as a standard that temporary farm worker housing should meet. And I can discuss VCH's comments later. So just in summary, with respect to temporary farm worker housing, SLRD staff are recommending to maintain the conditions that are set out in the previous amendment bylaw, and for the following reasons. So the proposed changes are supported by the Ministry of Agriculture and Food, the ALC, and Vancouver Coastal Health. And if you look at your reports, you'll see that we've appended those comments, and they provided us with very thorough comments and support for how we treat temporary farm worker housing. The SLRD could be liable if it were to allow temporary farm worker housing that does not meet flood construction level. There have been modeling assessments done of flood risk in the valley, and the SLRD really cannot disregard that information. An amendment is proposed, like I said, to allow the building official to make it clear as to whether geotechnical reports will be required or as part of a building application for temporary farm worker housing. The SLRD did some research. We could not find any other local government that is allowing temporary farm worker housing in wheeled accommodation. It seems that the typical is like ATCO trailers, and yes, some fill is required to be brought on for those, but once the temporary farm use is gone, the fill can be removed from the site and the land can be brought back. SLRD still feel that the statutory declaration is necessary for enforcement purposes. The ALC will be setting the time period a property owner can have temporary farm worker housing through an approval process. So the SLRD needs to ensure that they are aware if housing is no longer being used for temporary farm workers, we can enforce if required. And this is in line with what other jurisdictions are doing. And that would be so that temporary farm worker housing doesn't evolve into like a nightly rental situation, which is what we don't want to see on our agricultural lands. So condition staff are proposing to maintain our existing requirements under the SLRD's temporary farm worker housing application. So that's not proposed to change. We are proposing to remove the requirement for an SLRD application as it's now an ALC application. So this will sort of ease that part of the process. I noted the part about the fill can be removed, so it really shouldn't be a concern. We bring fill onto farmland often anyway when we're trying to solidify the soil. Structural engineers often require it. If you sometimes see on the farmland sort of a big pile of dirt, that's a preload in order to compact the soil. So it happens regularly. Overall, staff understand the concerns raised and do not intend to impose more restrictions that would make farming unviable. Staff feel many of the concerns raised by the farmers, raising costs, lack of housing, etc., do go beyond the proposed amendments. So that these are like more global issues that we have little control over. So the next part we wanted to discuss was camping definitions. So what we heard at the public information meeting, that there were people saying that we weren't enforcing people living on RVs, so living in RVs, I should say. They feel that there should be more enforcement on people living year-round and living in RVs as short-term rentals. So we're not proposing any changes around this. I just like to explain our bylaw enforcement process. We enforce on a complaint basis. So if someone calls us and files a report, we will go up, look at enforcement. And the ALC has limited capacity for enforcement. We've found they're often short-staffed, but between the SLRD and the ALC, we do try and enforce against any kind of violations on ag land. Another question that we heard was, why do we allow occupancy of our RVs during construction and not allow them for temporary farm worker housing? And that's, an interesting question. So there is a clause in the SLRD building bylaw that does allow people to live in RVs while they're building their house. So it gives people the ability to live in an RV, build their main house, and it's associated with the building permit. So when the building permit is fulfilled, as part of that, the condition of fulfilling requirements of a BP, the property owner has to remove that RV. And typically the RVs are actually hooked up to services, that the same services that the main house would be. So there aren't wastewater issues. They're connected to water, they're connected to wastewater. And so that's a bit of a point of difference. So that's why we allow them when someone's constructing a house. So just to go through some of the referral comments that we received, we re-referred the bylaw. So we had referred it once, and then we went back to a number of the referees, the departments that we had referred to, and asked them for further commentary. So the Ministry of Agriculture and Food did provide support for the proposed amendments, noting that they are in alignment with provincial regulations. Ministry staff specifically highlighted that the proposed amendments related to recreational vehicles and camping units do not further restrict farmers or agricultural producers' housing options. The ministry also pointed out that the Canadian Standards Association sets the types of accommodation that can be used as permanent and seasonal dwellings, and that while non-permanent structures like ATCO trailers are appropriate for seasonal worker housing, they do not feel that recreational vehicles are an appropriate form of temporary farm worker housing. So those were the comments from the ministry. From the Agricultural Land Commission, they confirmed that the proposed amendments to the bylaw are consistent with recent amendments to the ALC regulation and ALC's temporary farm worker housing policies and practices. The ALC staff supported the SLRD recommendations that the existing bylaw restriction be retained, restricting recreational vehicles from being residents for temporary farm worker housing on ALR parcels. They noted that it remains consistent with the ALC's perspective and practice that RVs are an additional residence and must be approved by the ALC as an additional dwelling in the ALR through a non-adhering residential use application. And lastly, Vancouver Coastal Health, who is one of our partners, and they deal a lot with wastewater and water throughout the SLRD, not just on ag lands. But we have requested additional comments from them, and they noted that Vancouver Coastal Health's involvement with private dwellings usually consists of responses to complaints. And they provide information and advice on health-related topics. Like SLRD staff, Vancouver Coastal Health has concerns with recreational vehicles and tiny homes on wheels being allowed as a type of dwelling. Vancouver Coastal Health is particularly concerned with servicing, so water and sewer. VCH agrees that the requirement for temporary farm worker housing should meet the BC Building Code and the Public Health Act. And this is an effective way of ensuring sewer servicing is in place. They also recommended adding a reference to meeting requirements for the Drinking Water Protection Act, which we have done. The Drinking Water Protection Act defines a water supply system as essentially any water supply with more than one connection. When these are created, the Drinking Water Protection Act must be followed. Generally, very small water supply systems are not economically feasible and difficult to regulate. This is a significant issue. For this reason, they recommend local government policies that don't allow the proliferation of small water supply systems. They suggest a formalized referral process between the SLRD and Vancouver Health, Vancouver Coastal Health, when the SLRD is referred temporary farm worker housing by the ALC. So if you see in the report, I'm not going to read it all because a lot of it is a repeat of what I've said. But if you look on page 7 and 8 of Brenda's report, she does a summary of really why RVs, tiny homes, and other wheeled vehicles really cannot be allowed in the SLRD because they don't meet the BC Building Code. And she summarizes some of the other issues. So if you want to have a look at those comments, some of that might stir some discussion for us today. But with that, that sort of summarizes all of the staff's comments with respect to the bylaw. And we're hoping now that we can get, we'll turn it over to the group for discussion. And if there is any other commentary that anyone has or any questions for our staff, Director Mack.
Yeah, in reference to Vancouver Coastal Health referring to sewer systems and that, it's all septic. There's no sewer systems in the agricultural area in Pemberton Valley, and I'm sure anywhere else in the regional district. So it's all septic systems.
That's right.
Not sewer systems.
Does anybody else have any thoughts or comments on the report that Brenda prepared? Alyssa?
Yeah, hi. So I had a lot of thoughts, and I don't want to totally monopolize the conversation and discussion, but I did write down a few notes. I read through the agenda package and the relevant ALC documents in preparation for this meeting. And honestly, I was left feeling a bit hopeless about my chosen profession. I honestly really believe, just like from a wide lens, that the ALC and SLR regulations that are in place and that we need to be following are really well intentioned, but out of touch with the current economic reality of farming in BC, and are really out of reach for an average farmer. Yeah, I think we all know Pemberton is a great place to farm. We have excellent soils, geographic isolation, and we're super close to Vancouver, which has like 60% of the population of BC. I think we punch well above our weight when it comes to agricultural capacity for those reasons. But yeah, we all know in order to operate farms, you need workers. Smaller scale organic farms like the one I run in particular require a lot more labor than larger conventional farms. I'd say probably between 0.5 to 2 workers per cultivated acre, depending on the intensity and mechanization of the operation. That being said, most of that labor is only needed for about half the year. Yeah, so farms need workers, workers need housing, but we're in the middle of a housing crisis in BC. And our province is also well known for being one of the most expensive provinces to live in. We try to pay our staff as much as possible, but this year, like returning staff who've been with us for multiple years are getting $20 an hour. That's far below the living wage for our region, which a recent report calculated as $24.08 per hour. So I think for all of these reasons, it's become increasingly difficult, I would even say impossible, for farm workers to find housing in Pemberton, let alone housing that's affordable. Yeah, so what's the option? Farmers have to find housing for farm workers on their farms. I don't think that's an ideal option. Like personally, I find it difficult enough to manage my workers, let alone be a landlord. That's not a hat that I want to wear. Yeah, I'm not keen to take on more hats. So yeah, when I read through the ALC regulations, I see that right now there's basically two options for housing farm workers on farmland. You're either building a secondary residence on the farm or using temporary housing. In terms of building a secondary residence, I don't think that's really a feasible option for farmers on leased land, which a large number of farmers in Pemberton I know are. I think it's also one that any farmer that really cares about the long-term agricultural capacity of their land, like considers lightly. That's something that, you know, could take away from the productive capacity of the land. Or if the land were to sell and there's a secondary residence, chances are it's not a farmer that's going to be buying the land, and that secondary residence is not going to be used for farm worker accommodation. Yeah, I would also argue another huge factor that the cost of building a secondary residence is out of reach for most farmers who are only living off what they earn from farming. But maybe not out of reach for non-farmers who happen to meet the very low criteria that gives them farm status on their land. So some stats from Stats Canada from 2021, so 2 years ago. I won't bore you with all the numbers, but basically I looked at the total farm cash receipts. I looked at the number of farms operating in BC and the expenses incurred for every dollar in revenue. And basically, long story short, farms are making about $45,000 a year in profit. That doesn't give farms the capacity to build a secondary residence with the cost of building housing in the Sea to Sky region. For us, that would be just enough to cover our next season's expenses before we have income coming in from our next year's sales without going into debt. So it's like we're using that money as seed money to start the year over and over and over. It's like we can't save that money to, in 10 years, be able to build a secondary residence. Yeah, it's really depressing, but those numbers check out. Like my partner and I have been farming for 10 years, and probably people think we're a successful farm. Yeah, this year we're hoping to pay ourselves $80,000, like together. Like our farm workers are making more per hour than we do.
Thanks, Alyssa.
Sorry, I'm not done.
Yeah, more, okay.
Yeah, sorry.
If you need a break, I can build on that while you.
No, let me
know.
Power through this. Thanks, Kevin. Yeah, so right now, like it looks like the SLA or the ALC is actually less restrictive when it comes to secondary residences on ALR land than the SLRD is. The ALC also says they prefer temporary housing for farm workers, including foreign workers, to be an existing building or residential structure constructed or manufactured to be moved from one place to another, installed on a temporary foundation with no basement. I couldn't really see in the AL regulations that recreational vehicles or tiny homes couldn't be used for temporary farm worker housing, only that they would be considered an additional residence. So my thinking, unless I'm reading the regulations incorrectly, is that a recreational vehicle or tiny home could be considered a secondary residence and wouldn't actually require a non-adhering residential use application unless there are a secondary residence on the farm. So again, that's where I see that the SLRD is more restrictive than the ALC in regards to temporary farm worker housing. And I know that they can be, that's what it says in the ALC. Yeah, and I think that I'm aligned with the ALC and the SLRD, and that the primary use for ALR land should be agriculture, and residential uses should be developed in a way that minimizes disturbances to agriculture. But I think that the SLRD's goal of improving the economic viability of farming, as described in the Area C Agriculture Area Plan, is actually thwarted by zoning bylaw 765 and its proposed zoning amendment bylaw. The Pemberton Farmers Institute just asking the FLC to perform a cost benefit analysis on section 6.7 of the bylaw regarding temporary farm worker housing. And I think this would be really interesting because from my perspective, the requirements of 6.7 seem both costly and onerous. Remember that actual farmers have very little time or money at their disposal. I've also heard from other farmers not great things, like folks that have at effort and expense situated their temporary farm worker housing above flood construction level, only to be told by the SLRD that it wasn't good enough, even though it received provincial and federal approval. I've also heard other stories from acquaintances, friends who have had difficulties with the SLRD building department, and that kind of creates an atmosphere of distrust. It seems quite likely that you could go through the time and cost required to jump through all the hoops to get this temporary farm worker housing and then be denied. So I think if the SLRD really wants to support the long-term viability of farming in Pemberton, then they need to be creative and innovative and create their own unique policies rather than to look what other jurisdictions are actually doing right now. I think regulations need to be put in place that actual farmers can easily and affordably meet, but are at the same time costly and onerous for non-farmers. Right now, it's the other way around. And I have no solution to how to do that, but I think it's possible. And that's where I think the subject of recreational vehicles and tiny homes is really interesting in this conversation. I think farming is a unique business. There's all sorts of agricultural exceptions and exemptions exist at local, provincial, and federal levels. And I wonder why that can't be the case here. I mean, recreational vehicles and tiny homes are non-permanent movable structures. They can be easily moved if a farm no longer required farm worker housing, if the land was no longer being farmed, or in the case of an emergency like a flood. They're small, which fits with the ALC's recommendation that the total residential footprint for each permitted temporary farm worker housing is no more than 35 square meters. They can easily be sited with the farm residential footprint and wouldn't require the construction of a foundation or the use of gravel or fill. I kind of disagree that fill brought into farmland can be easily removed. It's something that's hard to do and does require a significant cost. I don't think that recreational vehicles or tiny homes should just be allowed unequivocally, but I think there's got to be a way to balance the need for safe and healthy farm worker housing with the economic realities currently being faced by farmers. So yeah, I guess I don't really support the temporary farm worker provisions and definition of a recreational vehicle in this amendment bylaw. I would suggest that the AAC maybe make a motion to request the SLRD review the entire section 6 of the zoning bylaw and petition the ALC and the ministry for possible solutions for temporarily housing farm workers in light of the ongoing housing crisis that's happening in our province. Sorry, that was a lot.
Thanks, Alyssa. So you provided a lot of information there. So I just wanted to be clear, though, that the definition of the camping vehicle and tiny homes isn't not new. We're just making clarifications. The interpretation has been in place since about 2016. So that this isn't new.
I understand that, and I guess my thoughts on that were that I think it should be reconsidered.
Okay, and now I have a question for you. So we're aware that ATCO trailers as a form of temporary farm worker housing are acceptable because they do have a CSA standard. And actually they can be had for fairly cheap, in fact, often cheaper than an RV. So my question would be, why is that not something that you would consider for farming your workers? Housing your workers, I should say, not farming your workers.
I've been looking at ATCO trailers, to be honest, and from what I've been seeing, they are not cheaper than RVs.
No.
Like you can get an RV for, you could get a cheap one for $5,000. You could get a more expensive one for like tens of thousands. Whereas most of the ATCO trailers I've seen are like, you know, they're starting at $30,000 to $60,000. Then you're also needing the fill for the foundation. They're definitely, yes, they can be moved, but it's at a much greater expense to do that. Whereas I feel like the recreational vehicles, tiny homes, are much more nimble in that regard. And then I think there's also the fact that to have that sort of cost in a building that's only going to be used for, say, 6 months of the year, yeah, that's a lot of capital to put into something like that.
Isn't the main concern of the, you know, the ministry mainly to do with sewage and waste? And wouldn't it be smart to start looking at new ways of dealing with sewage waste that can enter our environment clean, such as composting, or even adding in a new septic field for RVs or trailers or tiny homes? Because to me, that seems to be the biggest concern, because you know, that's for clean drinking water, for clean land, is sewage. And that's like, I think behind everything, it comes down to that little aspect of it. Apart from the safety, but people have been living in 10 by 10 sheds on farms for years up the meadows, working on farms, woofers, you name it. You know, that's how I started out here, living in a 10 by 10 cabin using an outhouse. So I think that there needs to be a change in that to allow farmers to have that ability as well, to have people there to work the land, give them opportunity.
Yeah, and I think that aspect of dealing with the waste disposal definitely needs to be addressed. It can't just be, you know, being dumped out. But I think that it's totally possible to make that happen, and at a much less cost than installing an ATCO trailer and all of the associated. With an ATCO trailer, you're still putting in a septic field.
So I'm going to ask if people can raise their hands just so that we can have a bit of control over the meeting. Elliot, it looks like you wanted to say something, and then we'll go to Kevin after that.
The other thing, you know, to mention that was brought up was about fill for like ATCO trailers and stuff like that. And to tell you the truth, there is, you know, it'll take years for the change in soil if you were to remove that fill from that land, because you're bringing in biology from a foreign area, and that has to rebalance, and that can take up from like 6 months up to 7 to 10 years for that biology to rebalance, depending on where that soil or fill came from. And that's something that we don't really look at in modern day agriculture. It's slowly growing now in the agriculture industry, understanding the soil biology, but that alone can affect the soil and affect the land on huge levels. So that's all I have to say there.
Thanks, Elliot. We'll move to Kevin, please.
Yeah, I think there's been many good points made, and looking at how we kind of got here and what the unintended consequences have been is kind of important as well. Adding regulations to farmland is likely made in the best of intentions. When you're presented with a problem in front of you, you solve that problem, and you don't often see all the unintended consequences that come with it. You can look at Pemberton's entire diking system as a real life example of that. But essentially, the rules and regulations are what's driving farmers out of this valley. That's why my two neighbors are now billionaires and have helicopters, and they don't farm the land. It's because the strict regulations means that the value of the land is it can't return on the investment for the farmer. So the farm goes up for sale, and somebody who has no intention of farming it moves on to that land. So that's an unintended consequences of this problem. So there's a few things. I understand that there's the existing regulations, there's the existing rules, but it's okay, as Alyssa and Elliot has pointed out, it's okay to disagree with those rules, and that doesn't make them right. And I think as farmers and taxpayers, the SLRD and the ALC has a duty to take these seriously and lobby on behalf of their tax base against a rule, whether it's long withstanding or not, because we can all sit around here and think of 1,000 rules that we don't agree with or need alteration. So a well-intended rule 1 year, 10 years later doesn't make a lot of sense. And so I think that shouldn't be lost on us. It's just because there is a rule doesn't mean it's right and doesn't mean that we should all agree with it blindly. I believe that recreational vehicles and tiny homes should be allowed. I believe that because they're mobile, floods don't sneak up on us overnight. As long as they're able to be moved and have an area of refuge cited for them, I see no reason for an FCL designation for that. The FCL designation in Pemberton is done by geotechnical engineers that have very little knowledge of how we flood, and most often they're wrong. We've had houses built way too high and built way too low, all in the last 2 years, because it's not well understood. The models are wrong. They're mostly right, but they're not at all wrong, because they only model the Lillooet River flood from a Lillooet River dominant flood, not from a Ryan flood, not from anything else. So a geotechnical engineer, I know they're a professional, but they don't understand the mechanism of it. I don't think that bringing a complicated permitting process into this is good, because the regional district has no, from what I can tell, I go on every new property in the valley. If somebody builds a house, I go introduce myself. As the diking manager, I hear from them. Not one of them has a positive feeling coming out of building a house. And that's no slight on anybody. We're understaffed, overworked, building codes are changing. It's just, it's not a good process. And so adding a permitting process to this it's ridiculous unless it's going to come with the budget amounts to facilitate that dynamic process. Alyssa's 100% right. In my previous life, I owned an engineering and construction company where we worked in remote properties, and I used extensively ATCO style trailers. They are very expensive, very hard to move. A lot of times they're over width, over weight, over length. You can only pick them up so many times and move them before you have major issues. And although on the upfront, it looks like they're efficient to buy, the modifications to make them livable are very expensive because they're built in a modular way. I think that we're trying to control the uncontrollable, and that the reason we have high housing costs is a series of poorly thought out policy that starts at the federal, goes down to provincial, goes down to the local. It's a lack of understanding of simple economic principle, and now here we are. If we don't allow farmers to properly and adequately help themselves and their workers, then don't complain to me about a $10.99 cauliflower at the grocery store, because that's the end result. I really have a hard time with we create rules faster than we remove obsolete ones, and we don't often, as people, think about it long enough. And I really just think that this is a road we shouldn't be going down.
Thank you, Kevin. Did the ministry staff have anything they'd like to speak about with respect to either sewer, water, land compaction, or safety issues?
Jeff, do you want to take that?
Not specifically, because I'm not an agrologist and can't speak to land compaction issues. I can really only speak to the regulations and the rules as I've seen them, and stress that it is largely up to the local government whether or not what types of housing they choose to use and if they're appropriate. The piece that I included about about the Canadian safety standards was something that has come up previously in my work with the regional district on the island in terms of what's appropriate, and that's just mainly how those. I worked closely with building inspectors in a building department, and you know, the West Coast is harsh, and recreational vehicles are built for all types of conditions, but you know, the West Coast is very extreme, and in the Pemberton Valley, you have temperature swings that range from, you know, whatever you want to call it, minus 20 and above below sometimes, and in the summer it goes to 30. That's a huge temperature swing, and that weathers and degrades things quite quickly. And so in my planning experience with using those types of recreational vehicles for long-term housing, you can put some people at risk living in them. And so that's why I was cautioning using the Canadian safety standards, because that's just based on a personal professional experience for some years with the regional district down here. And I know it's not the same area and not the same geography, but there was some instances and some cause for concern. So we're here to sort of advise on I'm here to advise on sort of the land use and regulation side of it. Maybe I'll send it to Conley to discuss the land compaction and the risk of sewer. Kim, are you prodding on the contamination side, or like the sewer servicing and like capacity side for me to speak to? Or
I think we should talk about both issues, because these are RV vehicles essentially that would be sited on land, and there's, you know, currently no requirements that they be hooked up to septic, or we really don't know what goes on with the waste. So
yeah, I mean, I'll turn it over to Conley for any risk of contamination factor there, or compaction from like a strictly sewer servicing and complanning perspective. You know, you're putting a lot more residences on a piece of land that's not serviced, which means that piece of land wasn't intended for additional density, which means the services aren't necessarily prepared for that, and you can stick handle your way through it with requirements for septic and other things. But I think what the SLRD has laid out in its plans for growth and development are appropriate, and you know, putting a lot more residences on land is again something that we struggle back and forth with, between trying to support farmers that are there and stop people who are trying to buy land and put many large homes on it and not use it for agriculture. So as you pointed out, what's there doesn't appear to be working, but I don't want to really get into the whole discussion about what the rules are designed for in the regulations, but for the most part, it's for protection against the people that are trying to purchase land and not farm it, which sounds like it's happening anyway. But you know, that could be happening at a faster rate than it currently is, and so we are doing our best to support the SLRD, to support agriculture in a way that kind of slows that process down or stops it. So I'll maybe turn it over to Conley to back up on some of the technical stuff.
Yeah, I mean, as far as the septic goes, I think, you know, you would want something, probably a septic field that you could put that waste out on. That's probably like a case by case thing. I'm definitely not an expert in that, but contamination would be an issue. But I think it could be mediated with, you know, properly constructed septic fields. I mean, I agree with the temporary fill thing. I'm not sure how temporary that is. Typically, if you want to bring in fill, you would have to peel off the topsoil, and you'd need sort of like a QP to come out and kind of assess, you know, do a soil profile, assess the geotechnical capability of it, and what depth you need to strip to put fill on. I think if you're putting fill just on the surface of the soil, it's going to sink, it's going to move. I can't imagine that would work. So it doesn't feel particularly temporary to put fill on. But maybe there's other ways to do it I'm not aware of, but yeah, that's all I can add.
We're going to get to Anna, but before we get to Anna, I'd like to just go through, like, we did look at what other places are doing. So City of Delta specifies that farm worker housing must be a manufactured home or additional farmhouse, and they require that the FCL applies. They only allow these on a temporary foundation or footings. If it's not an additional farmhouse, they require farm status. Abbotsford requires farm status, and they either require farm buildings meet the CSA standards or a non-permanent foundation and without a basement. They require existing permanent buildings to be converted for use as temporary farm worker housing. They allow them for a maximum of 10 months in a calendar year. Township of Langley only allows occupancy in these vehicles between April and November. For migrant farm workers, specifically under the federal program, they require a covenant on the property, a statutory declaration, and financial security for their removal. They require a building permit. Richmond, they only allow temporary farm worker housing in certain zones. They require farm status, and they must meet the building code. They specifically state that these are subject to inspections at any time to ensure that they meet the regulation. So, you know, these are communities that have a lot more experience with farm worker housing and migrant farm workers than the SLRD. And the definite approach is to require building permits, because that is the only way that the local government has a way of ensuring that these are safe and that the effluent is being dealt with in such a way that there's no contamination of the site and there's no health and safety issues, and that the buildings are actually going to be secure and not deal with the issues associated with weather and collapse that we have seen in the SLRD. So on to Anna.
Kim, those are all good points, but the difference being that in the Lower Mainland, there's a lot of different there's more housing options for people to use. Like we are in this sort of special situation up here where we have all these really great ingredients for a successful agriculture industry, but we're missing this one housing piece in terms of options. I think there are like 400 or something Airbnb hosts in our area. And lots of us would much prefer to put our people up in an actual house somewhere around, not on the farm. It's better for the farmer and it's better for the worker, I think. But we just don't have that. We don't have that luxury in Pemberton. I also want to clarify about the RVs, Jeff. Definitely agree with our extreme weather. Most of us that have been using RVs for any length of time know that if you don't put them under cover in the winter and winterize them, drain them, do the whole thing, you're going to lose it. So that's what, you know, that would be best practices if you want to keep your RV for the next year. You only leave it out 1 or 2 winters before you realize that's the end of that RV. And certainly if we were, you know, when we spend money on something, we look after it to make it last. I guess I think we're out of time, so I won't take up too much more than half an hour or so, but just kidding. I think it's really important that I don't know if it's important or not, but we have a big divide here between what is actually happening and what is required of us. And I don't have any answers. I don't have any suggestions. All I do have one suggestion. I do think it would be really helpful for your SLRD, Kim, you guys, maybe with the help of the ministry, to do a cost benefit analysis on this, like figure out what you're asking, like what is the cost of what you're asking exactly. And we're not trying to be a sob story, like we don't really want help. We just don't want it to be made, we don't want it to be harder than it needs to be. We choose this profession, we believe in it. It's wonderfully rewarding, but we don't want local government to make it unattainable. And I'm sure local government doesn't want that to be happening either. And we're on board if you want to come up, like if we want to work on something together, like how can we make this like this really unique situation? We are a really unique situation. We can't be compared to the Fraser Valley or the Lower Mainland or anything like that. Let's, you know, we can figure it out, but it will take the both of us. That's all I have for right now.
Thanks, Anna. We'll go to Olivia Kester.
Thanks. Yeah, I just had 2 points that, or kind of questions maybe, that I wanted to bring up. And the first is there's a lot of discussion about sewage and where the wastewater is going. And I'm wondering why that can't be a requirement for recreational vehicles, like in the same way that it's discussed that if you're building a house and you can have a building permit to have your recreational vehicle there and it's hooked up to your sewage, like why can't, like whether it's a composting toilet or maybe hook up to the septic, like why is it just ruled out for the recreational vehicle instead of looking into a requirement there?
I'm going to turn this over to our building official, Jay, to answer this question.
Hi, Libby. Do you mind repeating that for me just piece by piece so I can go through this for you?
Yeah. My question is just why can't there be a requirement if recreational vehicles are allowed? Why can't there be a requirement that sewage needs to be dealt with? I feel like it's the main issue that's been brought up, but it seems like it is a solvable issue.
It definitely would be. The issue at hand is that existing septic, let's talk in a hypothetical, that an existing septic system that's designed for the single family dwelling on that home is specific to that home. When you add in new dwellings, it increases the hydraulic loads on those septic systems that they weren't intentionally designed to handle, and you could very quickly overwhelm a normally functioning septic system by accident, by being unaware that you're introducing 2, 4, 6 more people's daily hydraulic loads of regular life into a septic system. So this is where it becomes problematic, in that we would not necessarily us, but the onus would be on the homeowner to have their septic systems designed and confirmed by Vancouver Coastal Health in this instance that they are in fact ready and capable to receive these new loads imposed upon them.
Yeah, that's understandable, but then how come an ATCO trailer would be allowed and not a recreational vehicle? Or how come the use of a composting toilet or a porta potty or another use of like way to deal with sewage isn't being considered then?
More porta potties and things like that are more basically set up just to as temporary, I don't want to use temporary, sorry, as usages for minimal occupancies. So porta potties are really designed for events and job sites where people aren't going to be living there around the clock for extended periods of time using these things. ATCO trailers would be subject to the same thing for septic and wastewater disposal. That they would need to be connected to a septic system or on-site wastewater management system in the same manner. However, ATCO trailers, CSA Z240 MH standard mobile homes, they're designed to be lived in year-round if necessary. Kevin can probably attest to this with his experience in these. Whereas an RV, they're not meant to be lived in full-time. And the wear and tear on RVs, not to mention the life safety systems involved in their manufacturing, aren't meant to foster a full-time occupancy.
Yeah, I understand that. I feel like there could be I feel like there could be more of a compromise in an RV being used as for temporary use, not for year round. We're talking like, spring to fall months. I just feel like there could be more of a compromise instead of just saying no to recreational vehicles.
It's ultimately because of the fact that they weren't designed for long-term usages in that specified occupancy. And again, Anna makes a good point that a lot of RVs weren't designed for the snow loads in the Pemberton and Pemberton areas. So we have seen instances of complete structural failure of RVs after snowstorms or snow and rain. And there's really no checks and balances to ensure the safety of the occupants in these types of vehicles.
Okay. I had another question as well, and I know that money doesn't just appear out of anywhere, but I realize that it is a cost issue on the farmer. And like, I don't know if the SLRD ever does do cost sharing grants, but would that be an avenue that could be taken, of like a cost sharing grant for helping farmers have temporary housing?
I can speak to this, Olivia. That's an issue that really goes beyond this bylaw. I don't know if there is such a thing. I'm unaware of that. It's certainly something that could be looked at separate to this process. We're going to move on to Elliot.
Yeah, so we're talking about septic and stuff like that for people coming through. Well, the first thing I can say is a lot of the time farmers end up with a woofer or something like that, who are traveling, let's say from Quebec or something, out to British Columbia, and they come here and they have an RV that they want to stay in. Now the question is, how are they dealing with that sewage from those new tenants that are showing up in this RV to do, let's say, a month of work on your farm, but they're living in this temporary RV for that period of time? Could we not look into new forms of like above ground compost toilets that are separating units that create the human manure to be separated and to be properly composted as per the agriculture, I forget what it's called, standards basically for human manure. And the separation creates that to be a clean product that you can put around fruit trees and stuff like that. That's not going to create pathogens and toxic bacteria for human consumption if that was to happen, if it's properly composted. That's something that they're doing in many other countries in Europe, in the States, all around the world, I've been seeing now. The second thing is, another waste possibility could be us looking at, temporary tanks, like tanks that are to be filled and then to be pumped away. That's a cheaper option for farmers. The third thing I wanted to bring up was step code, building step code. And the step codes that we're at now are basically what are making it unobtainable for anyone, any new farmer or young farmer, to basically be able to build because of the cost that it takes to build that house to those step codes or that dwelling to that step code. Maybe we would be able to say, okay, if temporary dwelling for farmers, we drop that step code down to make it a bit less efficient in the sense, because people aren't going to be living in it in the winter times. They'll just be living in the summer times. So there's just numerous things that we could look at and change over the next years to come that will make it easier for farmers to have people come and help them out.
Thank you, Elliot. You've raised a number of issues and a number of very progressive thoughts about dealing with waste and construction. However, those are solutions that or potential solutions that go beyond the extent of this bylaw and currently are not allowed by the BC Building Code. So that's really beyond the scope of this. I understand that those are potential possibilities, but those are for a future time, I think.
Those are very important topics because all of it ties into this issue that we're having today. And that's pretty much, yeah.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to move on to Alyssa, and then I think we need to wrap this up because I think we're running over time here. So Alyssa, would you like to go ahead?
Sure. I just had a quick comment, and then I think Kevin actually had his hand raised. So maybe Kevin can end us off. But yeah, just a quick thought on the waste disposal for the RV. There's a waste disposal place at the Village of Pemberton. It doesn't seem unreasonable or difficult to have the waste disposed of regularly. if farm workers were living in an RV from say like May to October. And if records were kept, that seems to me could be proof to show that that's being done as like a condition of having them.
Thank you, Alyssa. We'll move on to Kevin for some final thoughts, and then I think it'd be good to wrap this up.
No, I'll be quick. My only thought was, is there a possibility of looking with maybe a member from each group that's all represented here, of possibly looking at identifying some section of land in Pemberton Meadows and making a area where RVs and trailers can be both used by transient workers and building permanent residences for this type of work.
Thanks. Kevin, I think that's something for these, the people at the meeting to go away and maybe, get together and look at sites. I'm sure the SLRD staff would be able to provide some guidance and some zoning information, but I think that's again, outside of the bylaw here, what we're trying to do. I see our building official has a comment, and then we'll go to Tara, and then I think we do on Director Mack. So Jay, please go ahead.
All right, just wanted to add to any members or anyone else present about this. If you do have any questions about the building code or building requirements, or want to carry on the discussion about effective ways from a building or building perspective to house employees, please feel free to reach out to me directly. You can find my email and direct contact information on the SLRD's website, and I'm happy to discuss any of this further. If anyone has any technical questions or even cost-related questions, I'm happy to help out and assist and even offer advice in some cases. So please feel free to reach out to us directly.
Thank you, Jay. Tara, you had some comments.
Were we supposed to choose like an option or something? What happens if we don't? And also, I'm feeling very, very sad because I feel like this is like a very, to me, it seems like SLRD is making a very black and white issue, and it loses the sense of community of how this valley started in farming. And yeah, I think that's it.
Thank you. We'll go to Director Mack.
Yeah, thank you. There was a reference made to step codes. The regional district does not have any step codes at this time. Is that correct?
Jay, I'll let you speak to the step code.
Currently, the SLRD is not enforcing the BC Building Code step codes. However, we are anticipating a new building code cycle change later on this year, in which step code will become mandatory. However, that's not necessarily the death sentence that maybe the media and people's preconceptions have thought it out to be. It doesn't necessarily mean that costs are going to balloon out of control for new housing, which is, again, sorry, why I brought up the point. If anyone has technical questions about this, I'm happy to take them offline and answer them more specifically as I can.
Yeah, well, just the point about the step codes, the province doesn't have any in place at this point either, I don't believe. So that's something that may be coming forward, and it may not be coming forward, but it most certainly has increased the cost of building per square foot going forward. So I think that's something that we really have to take into consideration because this is very impactful, obviously. Anyways, I think that Kim had mentioned she wanted to bring this to the 22nd board meeting for second reading. I think with all this discussion going on, I think it should come to the March EAD meeting, and it should be discussed there before it goes to the board. So that's the recommendation I would make.
Thank you. So in summary, I just wanted to speak to finally the bylaw. So it would allow for heights of farm residents and secondary farm residences to go from 8 to 9 meters. So there's an increase there. A secondary residence would now be permitted outright if it meets certain regulations. So that's an improvement from the current situation. The SLRD is actually requiring less for temporary farm worker housing, as most provisions are now set out by the ALC rather than the SLRD. Cannabis retail would be permitted under this bylaw as a form of farm gate retail sales on ALR land. Agricultural cannabis production will also be recognized as a use permitted on ag land. So those are the key changes to the bylaw. Not sure if members of the AAC wish to add anything further from their previous resolution, which I did mention earlier, or does the resolution basically remain the same, which was some concerns about temporary farm worker housing issues. Members of the AAC, anybody want to chime in?
I think for me, it would be the same resolution as last time to continue looking at the temporary farm worker housing.
Okay, thank you. Hearing that, what we may do is pivot a little bit with this bylaw. I have to give it a bit more thought, but the bylaw does not only apply to the farmlands in Area C, it also applies to Wedgwoods, and there are some people in Wedgwoods who are really looking forward to seeing the changes proposed by the bylaw. So what we may do is peel off the ag changes out of the bylaw and bring it back without the ag changes, and we can bring those back under a separate bylaw number. That may be our best way of moving this along.
Yeah, Kim?
Yep.
Yeah, my
Dr.
thought on that, yeah, I agree with that. The Wedgwood portion should be a separate bylaw, and then that can carry forward, and the rest of this stuff can be discussed further so that we can get it right before we move it forward.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, great. Well, thank you everybody for your time. I appreciate everybody coming out and your thoughtful comments. You know, there was a lot of material to read there, and so this has been, you know, very informative. Anna, did you have a question?
Can I just clarify that I just heard that you're going to peel off the agriculture bits? And
yes,
put that
I think
separate?
that's what we'll have to do in order to get the main bylaw moving forward, because there are people who are very keen to see other parts of
I
this
got
bylaw
that from
proceed.
the public meeting.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Kim.
Okay,
you.
everybody, thank you very much. And with that, we'll close the meeting. Have a good day.
Thanks, Kim.